When I first started going to school to become a teacher, we were taught that you got to make sure students know the rules and the procedures.
Rules.
Now, my first year teaching, I took their advice a little too much to the heart. True story, what I did is when students first walked into the classroom, what they saw were all my rules and procedures posted in my room. But it wasn't just one rule or procedure. It was literally 50 rules and procedures. I printed each one out on a piece of paper, and then I stuck them around the edges of the top of my room. So literally there were 50 pieces of paper all lined up around the top of my room, each one going over a certain rule or certain procedure. For example, to sharpen a pencil, raise your hand. And I had a gazillion of those. And so when students first walked in, you can definitely tell it was a little extra, as kids would say. Since then, and since 20 years has passed, I've come to the realization there's a much better way of doing it. And that's what this video is about. Kids already know what to do. They already know how to act in class. Now, whether they do it or not, that's a different story. But students, kids, I teach middle school, I would say middle school and up, even 6th grade, maybe 5th grade, they already know what they're supposed to do. They know how they're supposed to act in class. I always start with this story with my students, and this is at the beginning of the year. I'll go through the whole thing, tell them exactly what I just told you about how I had all these rules listed and everything else. And then I tell them I had this realization, and it goes like this. Somewhere along the way, I picked up the idea that, and I'm sure I read this somewhere or heard it somewhere, that it takes 10,000 hours of doing something to become proficient or an expert at that. So if you want to be a famous violin or become a really good violin, you got to practice 10,000 hours. If you want to get really good at jump shots, you got to practice 10,000 hours. If you want to become the best and best at video games, you got to practice at least 10,000 hours. The magical number there is 10,000 hours. And then I tell my students this. I said, let's do some quick math. If you go to school every day since kindergarten to 8th grade, how many hours have you been a student? And the answer is about 10,000 hours. And I tell my students, you guys are expert at being students. Doesn't necessarily mean that you get good grades and like that, but you know the game. And I do a real quick litmus test. I said, here we go. If you want to ask a question, what should you do? Raise your hand. If you want to throw a piece of paper, should you throw it from across the room? No. Should you poke the person in front of you with a pencil? No. They know what's expected from them. So with that said, when I start the beginning of school year, the first thing I have in my mind is this. Students already know how to act, and I don't have to reteach them everything. So if kids already know how to act in class, what are we doing? And it boils down to this. Your actions speak louder than your words. Let me explain. So if I have a rule or a procedure about how to do something, the first thing I need to do is practice that in my class, just to communicate that to the students, right? But just also so they are aware of exactly what I am looking for, because I need you to be quiet while I'm talking is different than what Mr. Smith's you must be quiet when I'm talking might be, you know? And so what happens on the first couple of days of school, I'll go through those things, my expectations, but those are just words. And students have heard those words time. And I mean, think about this. Over their 7, 8 years of schooling, they have heard those same exact things probably 100 of times. But the difference is not what you're saying, it's what you do after you say it. And that is your actions. And so the key to rules, whatever rules it is, isn't necessarily the rule itself. It is the action that follows that rule. Are you going to be consistent? Are you going to carry through what you've told the students? If you told the students it must be quiet before I talk, do you hold them to that, or do you give up too early? And so whatever rules you have is not necessarily as important as what you do with that rule. How do you enforce a rule? How do you carry that out? And are you consistent with it? And when students come into the class, do they know that you are going to hold them to a higher standard than most teachers? So how do you hold students to higher standards than most teachers? The answer is progressive discipline. Let me explain what I mean by that. Many teachers will kind of just put up with some sort of behavior they're not happy with, right? Those kind of put up with it, put up with it, put up with it. Eventually they get to a point where they just get frustrated and they lose it. So it could be Johnny in the back just talking to his neighbor, talking to his neighbor, talking to his neighbor, right? And so the teacher will put up with it, and just settle. Eventually to the point they get so frustrated, they just blow up and say, that's it, that is it. You have whatever the consequence may be. And so it goes from 0 to 60 just like that. And that is no good way to do it. It's not fair to Johnny, and it's definitely not fair to you as the teacher. A better way of doing it is progressive discipline. Because the reason Johnny's doing that, first of all, because he's thinking he can get away with it, because he's gotten away with it several times already. Logical sense. And so it's going to surprise him when out of nowhere, boom, you call him on it, right? You're in your mind, it's, hey, it's totally fair. I put up this so long, I can't take any more. But for Johnny, it's coming out of nowhere. And so if you have progressive discipline, and the thought behind progressive discipline is this, that you apply enough discipline, you apply enough pressure, you apply enough consequence just to alter the behavior, just to deter the behavior. Because if you go from 0 to 60 like that, it is going to be frustrating for you, frustrating for Johnny, and before you know it, you get a problem with parents, and it's just going to spiral out of control. So how this looks, as soon as Johnny's talking in the background, you call him out. If you, at the beginning of the year, you kind of stated, these are your expectations, now it's time for you to follow through. And so Johnny's background talking, you call him right away. You call him on it right away. And the first discipline could just be calling him out on that behavior. Say, hey, this is not what we're doing. I can't move forward until you stop talking. That might be the first step. And that's going to take care of maybe 80% of the students. But then there's that 20% where you have to take it to the next level. And so the next level is, hey, I need to talk to you after class. That might take care of another 10%, but they still got that 10% they're still acting up. And then that's when maybe you might have to call home. And then from there, the next step might have to issue a lunch detention for next year. But you see the idea. Instead of going from 0 to 60 like that, if you slowly put on the pressure, you're going to find out what students are going to adhere to the rules and expectations. And the students that don't adhere to it, that is when you kind of progress to the next level of discipline and consequences. But by doing that, and by doing that at the beginning of the year, you're going to set the tone for the entire year and what you're going to have the best year ever.